The first poet that we want to take a closer look at in this video is George Gordon Lord Byron. And the first thing that maybe needs to be said about Byron is that he is the probably the first celebrity author, really one of the starting points of the celebrity culture that we have today. So it's important to note how strongly in his initial reception and in his initial career, he as a person and his writing became intermixed, and that he presented himself strongly in through his writing, and gave the impressions that most of the characters, the central characters, are really thinly disguised versions of himself, and how strongly readers reacted to that because they were so interested in him and in his life, and were interested in sort of reading his life out of his works. Byron became immediately popular and famous with the publication of this work here, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, the first book of which was published in 1812, and and this is basically a travel account in poetic form. It is based on travels that Byron undertook, first through Spain and Portugal, and later on then into Greece and Albania. And Childe Harold, Childe is an old word basically for knight. So it tells sort of this story of this character Harold, but everyone, as I said, immediately recognized or thought they recognized Byron in that character, and that was an immediate success. The first edition, 500 quarto copies, that sold out in 3 days, and only 2 days later, a second and octavo edition of 3,000 copies was on the market, and that sold out as well. So from one day to another, Byron became well known. He actually himself remarked later, "I awoke one morning and found myself famous." And indeed, Byron, who had himself painted, as you can see here on the right side, in an Albanian, traditional Albanian costume that he bought on his travels, he did have a fascinating and sensational, and we would nowadays maybe say a romantic life, and he often emphasized this and the closeness of himself to his hero. So. And the different elements of his life and his personality have really fascinated his readers back then and have continued to fascinate readers today. Amongst these is his deformed lame foot. He had to wear special boots all of his time, and on the right hand side you see an image of himself on his deathbed, and you see how one of the feet is draped here. That of course sort of tied. It was an interesting combination with his generally very physically strong and active characteristics, but it also of course gave us echoes of this sort of satanic image of the club foot. Because he was a very good sportsman. He liked to swim, which is one sport where his foot wouldn't hinder him, and famously he swam all the way from Europe to Asia when he swam the Hellespont, and then wrote a poem about that in order to sort of further promote his physical prowess. There's also his sexual ambivalence. He was bisexual and had numerous affairs, both with men and women. Most notoriously, he had an incestuous affair with his half-sister, Augusta Lee. And then there is, besides the illegitimate children that he has, there is the sensational marriage and the widely published and discussed separation from his wife. Here you see contemporary caricature of Byron saying goodbye to his wife, and already in the arm of one of his girlfriends. And then finally the point where scandal and debt becomes so bad that he has to leave England and basically go into a self-imposed exile on the continent. Again, this is a contemporary caricature of Byron leaving England and going to the continent, having a good time. All the while, you see here again, he's in the company of several women. He has wine with him, and if you look very closely here, you can see a special cup that he had that was made out of a skull, and we know that he has this because again he wrote a poem about this. So all of these are aspects of his persona. And then of course finally there is his tragic death while promoting the Greek independence movement in 1824 at a young age. So he actually dies a martyr for the cause of freedom, and that is sort of the final stroke in really making him an incredibly popular figure. But of course, we have to be aware that this idea of Byron, who he was and how he appeared to his contemporaries, is very much a creation, is really a literary creation, and that in fact is one of his most important contributions to literary history. This construction of a whole character archetype that we have come to call the Byronic hero. A lot of influences go into this Byronic hero that also show us that he's really sort of a child of Romanticism. There is the character of Prometheus, but also that of Satan, particularly Milton's Satan. So these larger than life rebel figures that defy superior powers. But mixed in with that is the sentimental heroes that we find in the fiction of Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, so someone like Werther. So it's a rebellious, strong, revolutionary figure, but one that is also sensitive and that can feel deeply. But mixed with that are the hero villains of the Gothic novels, like those by Horace Walpole or Anne Radcliffe. So it's not a purely nice and sympathetic figure, but rather one that is also dangerous in that respect. So there's also a little bit of Friedrich von Schiller's Karl Moor in him, or someone like Sir Walter Scott's Marmion. So all of these together form this idea of the Byronic hero. And the traits of this character are this romantic melancholy, right? This is a deeply feeling but very reticent character, because usually he carries some kind of secret guilt in some secret sin in his past. But he's also characterized by his pride, by his defiance of authority, and by a restlessness, by not being able to stand still, by being driven from place to place, from idea to idea, by the idea of, he's characterized by the idea of alienation, of being distinct from all the others, set apart. And often you have sort of elements of revenge, maybe remorse. Think of the secret guilt, moodiness, but also any kind of noble virtue such as honor, altruism, courage, and sometimes pure love for a gentle woman. So these are characteristic quotes here. I have not loved the world, nor the world me. This is the alienations, the being distinct. I have not flattered its rank breath, nor bowed to its idolatries a patient knee. So I'm above this, I'm defiant, I'm not touched by this. But behind this, there's also some feeling of guilt. I stood among them, but not of them, in a shroud of thoughts which were not their thoughts. So it's not a hermit, it's not someone who goes away and stays away, but rather someone who is in the midst of things, but yet separate, yet distinct from everyone else. And here's another quote that from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage that shows us sort of the restlessness and this ever being driven of the character. But quiet to quick bosoms is a hell, and there hath been thy bane. He's talking about himself. There is a fire and motion of the soul which will not dwell in its own narrow being, but aspire beyond the fitting medium of desire. So we also see this sort of overreacher kind of gesture that is the Promethean spirit, beyond the fitting medium of desire. And but once kindled, quenchless evermore, preys upon high adventure, nor can tire of aught but rest. A fever at the core, fatal to him who bears it, to all who ever bore. And this character not only has a lot of ancestors that go into its formation, but he really has become a very, very productive character that will return long after Byron's own work in other works, starting with characters like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights or Rochester in Jane Eyre. But that is with us still, and we can find him in numerous forms in pop culture as well, and we can recognize many of the traits that went into the Byronic heroes in these characters. While I could go on talking about Byron for hours, I should at least mention what is considered to be his real masterpiece, and that is his epic poem Don Juan. So in his earlier works, like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, but also in a series of Oriental tales, he developed this notion of the Byronic hero. And then in his later life, as you see, he didn't get very old. He started to write this huge epic poem that is based very loosely on this archetypal character of Don Juan, the seducer that we know from earlier versions, although Byron's version is a very different one. As you can see here, he wrote for this for a number of years, starting in 1818, and basically continued all the way until his death, when he left the work unfinished. And still, it turns out to be one of the longest poems in English. It is really very, very substantial, and not only that, it is kind of a new epic saga that moves literature in a way from Romanticism all the way almost into postmodernism. Now, if Wordsworth's Prelude is sort of the modern epic, the epic about the inner life of a person, then this is an epic again about the world, but about how unpredictable and uncontrollable and probably also devoid of order and structure and justice the world is. So Byron really tried to capture life in its essence. This is from a letter that he wrote about Don Juan, and when he asked his correspondent, "Is it not life? Is it not the thing?" So this is, he really wanted to capture some kind of essence, but this essence is a comic one, but a darkly comic one. So Don Juan is a really very funny text as well, in that it makes fun of all our pretensions to meaning and to higher values, and undercuts them with a very successful form of humor. Byron's deflation of human ideals and pretensions establishes a fallen world of disappointments and uncertainties. Juan, the main character, seeks a paradise which constantly eludes him. It's also sort of a picaresque novel in the sense that this character is driven from one scene to the other. He's basically going all over the world, being shipwrecked, as you see here in this famous scene, and traveling all over the world. No hope of paradise is possible as Juan encounters the evils of war, the tyranny of Catherine the Great, and the hypocrisies of English society. So this is the the story of Juan as this character who stands for the plight of human beings, as we might say, in a confused and in a confusing world. But this is just one half of the greatness of the text, and the other is the narrator. Now, remember, this is a poem. This is written in rhymes, in a very intricate rhyme form, the ottava rima, and but it's also a novel. Because it has a narrator, it has someone who tells that story, who narrates the story, and that narrator becomes very, very present. So in a way, he takes over the tradition, the Fielding tradition of having this auctorial commenting narrator. But this narrator goes even further. He's also sort of a Sternian narrator that constantly reflects about his own creation, and that becomes actually one of the major characters of the whole work. So if Juan presents the plight of human beings in a confused world, then the narrator suggests what might be the best response to such a world. Throughout the work, the narrator, remains the one constant, dominating and unifying presence. He is a complex and shifting personality who both is and is not Byron. He is a sophisticated observer who views the world with cynical amusement, yet as he talks on, he also displays warm sympathy for the foibles of humanity. It is through the interaction of narrative and narrator that Byron has created a work which is epic in scope, modern in spirit, and one of the great comedies of English literature. And I'm just going to give you, just so that you hear the sound and also the form of the ottava rima. This is from the beginning, the opening, which is usually sort of the incantation and the setting out of the subject. And it starts like this: I want a hero, an uncommon want, when every year and month sends forth a new one, till, after cloying the gazettes with cant, the age discovers he is not the true one. Of such as these I could not care to vaunt. I'll therefore take our ancient friend, Don Juan. We all have seen him in the pantomime, sent to the devil somewhat ere his time. The next author on our list is Percy Bysshe Shelley, so the middle name is pronounced like fish. And the life and works of Shelley exemplify Romanticism in both its extremes of joyous ecstasy and also brooding despair. While Shelley shares many basic themes and symbols with his great contemporaries, he has left his peculiar stamp on Romanticism, particularly through the creation of powerful symbols in his visionary pursuits of the ideal. Shelley was always trying to attain some kind of ideal, which is at the same time tempered by a deep skepticism. So we have these two, the optimism that comes out of Enlightenment thinking, which was very, very influential on Shelley, which is tempered with the skepticism that we've encountered in a very extreme way in Byron's writing, for example. In many ways, the lives of the younger generation of romantics really reads like a soap opera in the way that their lives and their lines intersect, and particularly the saga around Shelley and his circle. Now, as I said, Shelley was influenced by an Enlightenment radical thinking, and the person who incorporated this most clearly was William Godwin, the most prominent radical philosopher of the late 18th century. And Shelley wrote to him and told him that he admired him, and they started a friendship. Now, Godwin, before that time, had married the most well-known and most notorious female radical philosopher of his time, and that was Mary Wollstonecraft. Both of them actually had written against marriage, but nevertheless, they married. And they had one child, and Mary Wollstonecraft tragically died in childbirth. But the child that they had was Mary Godwin Wollstonecraft, who Shelley would meet when he came to the Godwin household, and they would fall in love, and they would actually run away for 2 times. And at one point, when Shelley's first wife committed suicide, he would marry her, and she would be turned into Mary Shelley. And of course, as Mary Shelley, she would go on to write and publish Frankenstein, which we have already briefly talked about. And here you see the two journeys that the Shelley circle, Shelley with Mary, and also their stepsister, her stepsister, undertook. One of them was down the Rhine and then through Germany, and the other that was the 1814 one. And in green here you see the journey from 1816, which went into the French Alps. This is where they spent most of their time around Geneva, and this is also where they met Byron for the first time, and where Shelley started his friendship with Byron. And this meeting in 1816, there is sort of the stuff of literary legends. This is the Villa Diodati, which was on the shores of Lac Léman, where they met, and where the weather was terrible, because 1816 came to be known as the year without summer, because there was, in the year before, there was the eruption of a volcano, which basically covered all of Europe in a cloud of ash, which meant that it was raining all the time, which meant that they had to be indoors all the time, which meant that they were bored. And at one point, Byron said, well, why don't we start a ghostwriting contest? And this is the germ for Frankenstein. They all wrote ghost stories, and some of them got published, but the most well-known of these, of course, is Frankenstein. In fact, this moment in literary history has so occupied people that there are numerous films that really center on these days and weeks there at the Villa Diodati. These are just four of the more prominent ones that look at the coming together of these different minds, and how they interact, and how they influenced each other. And then, of course, in good romantic fashion, Shelley heeded the later rock and roll advice: live fast, die young, and leave a good-looking corpse. In that he tragically died in a boating accident, and drowned, was washed ashore, and was burned on the beach. This is an image that shows this moment, of course, with his friends. So here, this is Byron, who's present. This is at the time when Byron is already self-exiled on the continent, and they both live in Italy at the time. So that kind of completes the myth of the romantic poet who is misunderstood and who dies tragically young. Particularly in his early years, he is the most explicitly political of the Romantic writers. Already as a student, he gets expelled from Oxford University for writing a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. He then writes an address to the Irish people, which basically urges the Irish to get rid of the English, and he actually goes over there to distribute it. But that doesn't work really well, because they think he's radical, and they don't want to listen to him. Queen Mab, another early work, is also a very, very political one. But later on, he also becomes maybe the most deeply philosophical of all the Romantic authors, and all of his works are imbued with philosophy and with a lot of thinking. So where Byron always reads either interesting or funny, and is comic in many respects, Shelley is the kind of writing, it's beautiful writing, but it's writing that makes you think, and also makes you pause and read again some of the things that he says. So these certainly aren't easy texts, but compressed in a few lines, you can find a whole lot of philosophy. I want to exemplify this by looking at one of the central topoi of Romanticism. We already saw this at the beginning when we looked at the aesthetic revolution that came about with the the perspective on mountains as something that is not just ugly but actually grandly beautiful. So that was one of the things that kicked off an aesthetic development that moves us towards Romanticism. And in fact, in Romanticism, mountains become a central topos. And this, of course, also is one of the reasons why the Shelley circle would go there, would go to Geneva, and in order to see the French Alps. And this is what they do in a trip to Mont Blanc. And Mont Blanc, as the highest mountain in Europe, becomes sort of the culminating point of this idea of the sublime. And you find Mont Blanc in the writing of Byron. You find it in Frankenstein, where one of the climactic scenes of the novel is actually set at the foot of Mont Blanc. And there's also a number of poems written, and one of the central texts of Shelley is written about Mont Blanc. And I want to contrast this to an earlier romantic poem, which is also about Mont Blanc. So the first excerpt is from a Mont Blanc poem by Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who characteristically had not been to Mont Blanc. He had only seen images of it, and he bases his text on this. Okay, here's the passage where he addresses the mountain and these elements that he sees. Ye ice falls, ye that from the mountain's brow adown enormous ravines slope amain, torrents, methinks, that heard a mighty voice, and stopped at once amid their maddest plunge. Motionless torrents, silent cataracts. These are the glaciers. Who made you glorious as the gates of heaven, beneath the keen full moon? Who bade the sun clothe you with rainbows? Who with living flowers of loveliest blue spread garlands at your feet? God! Let the torrents like a shout of nations answer, and let the ice plains echo, God! God, sing ye meadow streams with gladsome voice. So Coleridge shares this experience of the sublime faced with the mountain, but he turns that into a very clear religious experience. He says, okay, so I'm feeling something, I'm feeling grander, and who's the source of that? And that must be God. And we must remember that Coleridge also was a deeply religious person and a clergyman, and this is the explanation that he gives for this experience. Now let's compare this to a passage from Mont Blanc from Shelley, where he sort of asks a similar question. Now we have that experience of something great, something transcendent, something far more deeply interfused, as Wordsworth put it in Tintern Abbey. And he writes here, some say that gleams of a remoter world visit the soul in sleep. So that's much more vague and much more distant than Coleridge's "This speaks to me and it says God." Maybe we get these gleams of a remoter world in sleep. I look on high, basically at the summit of Mont Blanc. Has some unknown omnipotence unfurled the veil of life and death? Or do I lie and dream, and does the mightier world of sleep spread far around and inaccessibly it circles? For the very spirit fails, driven like a homeless cloud from steep to steep that vanishes among the viewless gales. The spirit fails to comprehend that, right? The spirit isn't even able to understand the vastness. This is the sublime in its purest form. Far, far above, piercing the infinite sky, Mont Blanc appears, still, snowy, and serene. The wilderness, this is still Shelley, has a mysterious tongue which teaches awful doubt, or faith so mild, so solemn, so serene, that man may be but for such faith with nature reconciled. So an awful doubt, a faith that is so mild, so serene. So we don't get this very clear-cut expression of a religious experience, but rather this notions of something. Right? Remember what I said about the aesthetics of unattainability. There is something out there, but I can't grasp it. I can't put my finger on it. Instead, thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe, not understood by all, but which the wise and great and good interpret or make felt or deeply feel. So all the codes of fraud and war, this is basically established religion. This is institutionalized religion, which is kind of swept away by the experience of the sublime of the mountain. But this isn't all. It isn't just that Shelley isn't as clear in his expression of what the meaning of the experience of the mountain is, because he also brings in what we said, the subjectivity of the recipient, when he basically says, well, but what is the meaning of all of this without someone perceiving it? And this leads to the famous final lines of the poem, where he asks a question that is really very difficult to answer or even to understand. And what were thou, and the thou is Mont Blanc, what were thou and earth and stars and sea, if to the human mind's imaginings silence and solitude were vacancy? So what would you all be, all of these prime symbols of the sublime, if silence and solitude were just nothing in the human mind, without a human mind to give meaning to all of these, because all of these are basically silent and humanless elements that we imbue with meaning. So this is this back and forth between nature and the subjective consciousness that gives something to the experience, and only in the connection of both can meaning actually exist and be constructed. And this brings us again to the final point, which is the poet as the mediator of that, the one that creates an artistic expression out of these experiences and out of these wanderings, and this is encapsulated in one of Shelley's central text, but also a text that is very central to Romanticism and to an understanding of literature in general. And this is Shelley's essay, "The Defense of Poetry." Now, this was prompted by another essay by Thomas Love Peacock called "The Four Ages of Poetry," where he basically says, we don't need poetry anymore because we need scientists, we need people who do something useful. Now that was satiric, it was tongue-in-cheek, but Shelley took it a little bit more seriously than he maybe should have, and he wrote this answer, which is the defense of poetry. Now, with poetry, of course, Shelley means much more. He defines poetry in such a way that it includes all of the arts and all creative endeavors that bring permanent beauty or goodness to the world. And Shelley argues that the social and the moral benefits of poetry are real. Poetry can help moral progress, keep pace with scientific and material progress, because without this perspective, the purely functional knowledge and the purely functional that science brings with it wouldn't have a meaning and wouldn't be embedded in human practices. So here you can take a look at the last lines of the essay, where he makes one of the central claims that is often repeated. Poets measure the circumference and sound the depth of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. So the poet isn't about to express his own opinion, but rather is a sort of a conductor for the spirit of the age. Poets are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.